A warm welcome to you all to this session on global inequality and social protection. As you know, it's co-organized with the World Inequality Lab, and which I have the greatest pleasure to moderate. Today's webinar will try to connect the dots between different pieces of research that were carried out recently. First, we'll hear from insights from the World Inequality Report 2022 that uses enhanced data sets. And as you know, we've been partnering with the World Inequality Lab for a number of years now. Second, we'll have a look at inequality, but from a human development perspective, to kind of broaden the perspective and look at inequality beyond income. And finally, we'll be also building on recent UNDP policy briefs that have been developed to explore innovative approaches connecting inequality analytics and social protection. Dear colleagues, with that in mind, allow me to start by sharing three messages. First is that the COVID-19 shock has raised income inequality levels, both between and within countries. And this has clearly tempered the narrative of a declining global inequality that was prevailing prior to the pandemic. And we're seeing clearly that inequality between countries has increased due to the uneven recovery. We're seeing a slower recovery in emerging markets and developing economies. On the other hand, we also note a growing within country inequality. And this comes clearly as a result of severe job and income losses among lower income population groups. The second message is that despite immense global efforts, half of the world's population still lacks adequate social protection. Today, large segments of the population remain excluded, notably informal workers and women. In addition, existing social protection programs remain inadequate. And in that regard, I think one key takeaway is that the pandemic has definitely helped reinforce our understanding of the importance of social protection frameworks. Against this background, the question we're asking today is this one: how are inequality and social protection linked? And what we'll try to do with our panelists is to discuss new trends and perspectives on inequality and social protection, with a focus on how they're actually connected and what policy choices are needed to maximize impacts on both fronts. In that regard, we are thrilled to have a distinguished set of panelists for our event today. I'm starting with Luca Chancel, who is the co-director of the World Inequality Lab. Luca, a very warm welcome to you. We also have Heriberto Tapia. Heriberto is the Research and Strategic Partnership Advisor with the Human Development Report Office at UNDP. Hello, Heriberto, and welcome to you too. We also have Shivani Nayar, who's a social protection policy specialist and also a co-author of a recent brief on the inequality gap, looking at the bottom 40%, and really shedding some insights as to the fact that the bottom 40 may be further away than we thought. We also have Santiago Soto, who is a public policy specialist and sits with the University of Oxford. Santiago, warm welcome to you too. And last but not the least, we also have Maria Montoya Aguirre, who's an economic analyst with UNDP and sitting at the Strategic Policy Engagement. And she and Santiago recently authored this brief that examined the social protection policy responses aimed at protecting income and job losses amidst the pandemic. Thank you all, the panelists, for being here today with us. Just quick housekeeping rules. To everyone watching, I would suggest that you type your questions in the Q&A box whenever you want, and our panelists will do their best to address them as they come in. So that will give us the opportunity to really have some interaction. After the panel discussion and during the Q&A session, you'll also have the opportunity to raise your hand for any comments, suggestions, or reflections that you may have. Without further ado, let me now turn to Luca for his keynote remarks that will be focusing on the presentation of the World Inequality Lab Report 2022. Luca, once again, a warm welcome to you. Thanks for being with us, and over to you for 20 minutes. Over.
Thank you so much, Mansour, for the presentation and the warm welcome. Good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be able to present this work in the context of this webinar. So as Mansour already introduced it, I'm going to focus mainly on some key findings of the World Inequality Report 2022, and my presentation, so the next 20 minutes, will be divided into 3 sections, really. One will be about why we're doing that, why we, the World Inequality Lab and its partners, including the United Nations Development Program, and we thank again the UNDP for this support over the years that allows us to produce this set of inequality metrics, inequality statistics that we think are key if we want to be able to say meaningful things about social protection and about economic policies in general. So that's the first point. The second point is going to be about what we have learned from recent research in global income and wealth inequality dynamics. And the third point about the new frontiers of global inequality research, and I will focus rapidly on gender and carbon injustices. Now, I just realized that I need to plug my computer before it switches off. So if you just allow me 30 seconds, I'll do that. Perhaps I'll just switch off the mic for just 30 seconds, very short.
No problem, Luca. We'll be waiting and fully understood. So, colleagues, as you know, the World Inequality Report is actually published on a yearly basis, which give us really great insights into kind of an enhanced data sets that goes just beyond the traditional data that we have, and that helps us kind of get a better perspective on global income and what's dynamics. So I think this should be an interesting piece of presentation. So look forward to hearing from Lucas to share with us its presentation. And apologies for the technical hiccup, but it shouldn't take long.
Okay,
great. Lucas back. Perfect.
Thank you very much, and sorry for this little interruption. I think my screen is back. All right, so let me start with the first pillar of this short presentation about missing inequality data from a lot of public statistics that are published, that are produced out there in the world. We know about the rise of inequality through a series of pieces of information, which include leaks from these media reports, these magazines, these newspapers telling us about the extent of offshore wealth, of tax evasion that regularly are published in the papers that have been published over the past 10 to 15 years. We also know about the rise of global billionaires and multimillionaires through the Forbes rankings, the Bloomberg rankings, or the so-called rich lists. We also see social movements out there in the world, in rich and emerging countries alike, that protest against rising inequalities. One of the key issues, though, is that in most countries, public authorities, governments still struggle to publish basic information about the distribution of income and wealth. That is, detailed information about the losers and the winners from economic growth or from the rise in wealth. So the absence of precise information on the growth rates of income, whether pre-tax or post-tax or wealth, at different levels, different percentiles of the income or the wealth distribution, the absence of this information is an issue in democratic societies, because this doesn't make it possible to assess, to review the work of governments. It's a basic democratic accountability issue in democracy. So what we try to produce at the World Inequality Lab is a series of methods, of standards that help us address this informational gap. I won't spend too much on this slide. I hope it might be available online for those who want to have a further look at it, but this is just to say that the work I'm going to present is really based on, several decades of research, of innovation in economics and in statistics. And what we try to produce is a flexible, collaborative, and cumulative approach to the measurement of income and wealth inequality, which actually dates back the pioneering work of Simon Kuznets in the 1950s, Tony Atkinson in the 70s, and this work was picked up by scholars, including Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, and many other colleagues, dozens and dozens of colleagues over the past decade. And so I won't name or cite all these colleagues. Maybe some of you are listening, attending to this webinar, but this really is an international effort to pick up the different data sources that are produced by governments, by public administrations, tax departments, and to assemble them in order to reveal trends, to reveal economic developments that are not necessarily visible if we're not doing this work of reconciliation of the various pieces of information available out there. The work we're doing, initially stemming from the scholarly world, the academia, is being done increasingly in partnerships with institutions. And this is where, this collaboration that we've been extremely lucky to have this collaboration with the UNDP over the past few years. I think it's key. Why? Well, because there's a lot about standardization here of how we do this work, how we develop common standards, common approaches to the measurement of inequality. There is today a very wide ecosystem of actors looking at inequality, trying to better measure it. And so this big community of researchers, I think, is confronted to common challenges, that is heterogeneity of data, lack of common standards, and this community of researchers, different centers in different parts of the world are also going towards common goals. That is, we're trying to develop public data systems that are really fit for the challenges of the 21st century. And in order to unify all this work, the UN has really all its role to play. And this is the role that the UN community has played over the past decades since its creation, really, in the domain of public statistics, GDP statistics with the UN Stats Division, and beyond GDP measures, human development indexes with the United Development Programs in particular. So this really is a collaborative work and increasingly done in partnerships with international organizations. So the World Inequality Database today is the product of all this work, and we cover now more than 140 countries with income and wealth inequality or aggregate series, and with other new measures of inequality, including gender inequality and carbon inequality. I'll say a few more words on this in the coming minutes. All right, so this was a very short wrap-up of why we're doing that, and I tried to be a bit fast on this in order to focus on some of the key findings here of the latest report. Obviously, I won't be able to present the entire report. It's available online on WID.world. And again, thanks to the support of the institutions that finance us, it's available for free open access for anybody who wants to have a look at it or potentially, join the efforts to improve some of the series. So we really see as a public good, and the fact that it's open access is one way to reveal this. Okay, so let me start with some of the key basic facts here about global income and wealth inequality. And so this graph tells us about the level of concentration of income in the world today and the level of concentration of wealth. So on the left-hand side of the graph, you have these three groups of the population, 3 bars, 3 histograms, telling us the share of income captured by the bottom 50% in blue, the middle 40% in green, and the top 10% in red from left to right, left-hand side panel. In a perfectly equal world, well, the bottom 50% of the population would capture, by definition, 50% of the total, and the top 10% would capture 10%. In a perfectly unequal world, the bottom 50% would capture 0% of the total, and the top 10%, 100% of the total. In terms of income concentration, where we're at today in the world, well, it's neither 100% unequal, neither 100% equal, in fact, quite far from that. The top 10% of the population actually captures close to half of the total, whereas the bottom half, the poorest half of the world population, gets a little less than 10% of all incomes. That's for income. Now, if we look at wealth, without much surprise, it is indeed more concentrated, but to what extent? Our report 2022 made key developments towards the domain of wealth inequality measurements, and we were not able to produce such numbers with this level of precision in the past report. There's still a lot of work to be done, still a lot of improvements to be made, but still we're more confident with these numbers today, thanks to 4 years of research on these topics. And what we find is really this striking level of wealth inequality at the level of the world. Half of the world population owns just 2% of the total, whereas the top 10% capture more than 3/4 of all wealth there is to own. So that's for the global numbers. Now, the work we do is really about learning from country or regional differences and divergences in inequality levels and inequality trajectories. So this is this new graph here tells us about the diversity of income inequality regimes across the world. So here you have the set of world regions from Europe on the left to Middle East, North Africa on the right-hand side of the graph. So the regions here are ranked from left to right, from the least unequal to the most unequal when talking about income inequality. And what you observe here is, to some extent, a diversity of income concentration levels, whereby the top 10% capture close to 35% of the total in Europe, and over 55% of the total, or close to 55% and over, in Southeast Asia, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, or Middle East, North Africa. The counterpart of these differences in the concentration of income at the top 10% is indeed lower income shares for the bottom 50% that are going to capture between 10% or 20% of the total. So that's a huge difference, a factor 2 difference in the share of what the bottom 50% captures in these different income inequality regimes we observe across the world. Now, where do these differences come from? What do we learn in this report? And what are the big underlying drivers of income inequality? And so this is also a novelty of this report, is that we're able to look at both pre-tax and post-tax inequality. Inequality of income before taxes and after taxes. So what you observe on this graph now is two axes, a horizontal axis where we are ranking countries according to the level of inequality before taxes. So if you're on the left-hand side of the horizontal axis, it means you're a more equal country. The indicator that we look at here is the average income of the top 10% of earners divided by the average income of the bottom 50% of earners. Okay, so on the horizontal axis, it's before taxes. Now on the vertical axis, we look at the same indicator, except we look at it after taxes. And so what this graph tells us is that inequality differences after taxes are in fact mainly explained by differences in inequality before taxes. What does it mean? It means that countries that are more equal are essentially more equal, not mainly or not solely because of what we may call redistribution mechanisms, so mechanisms that will change the distribution of incomes from the before taxes to the after taxes situation, but mechanisms that are going to have some impacts before that in the distribution of market incomes, in what is happening when income are distributed on the market. And so by pre-distribution, this broad term, we mean policies like minimum wages, regulations, public services, for instance. Now, let me clarify a very important thing here, because our results are not really opposing pre-distribution, so things like minimum wages, regulations, public services, and redistribution, measures, policies like progressive taxation, for instance. For one simple reason, which is the following: public services require government revenues. And the question is also how we finance these government revenues in ways that do not further increase inequalities. And this is where you really need progressive taxation to finance pre-distribution. So pre-distribution and redistributions are two halves of the same walnut. I'll say a little more about this in the coming slides. So this was for income inequality, where we observe some variation in terms of the outcomes. So very high income inequality regimes with relatively more equal regions. Now, when we look at wealth, well, really, there are also some differences across the world. But the key striking point is that no region is really able to guarantee a substantial share of wealth for the poorest half of the population. In no region of the world do we observe a wealth share for the bottom 50% that's over 5% of the total. So everywhere, the poorest half of the population owns close to nothing. And this is, a very striking result from this research, meaning that if some countries were able to do a little better than others when it comes to income inequality, in terms of wealth, most of the work, most of the policy action remains to be done today. And the top 10% owns between 60% to 80% of the total, according to the region that you're looking at. Here again, we're looking at the same regions as the previous slide. All right, so what have we also learned from this report and from the body of research on global income and wealth inequality? Well, if we look at trends over countries over the past 80 years, so up to now I was just looking at snapshots of inequality at a given point of time. Now let's say a few words about the trends, the dynamics, the trajectories. Well, these trajectories inform us that policies matter, and they matter a lot. Look at this graph. Here I'm back to income inequality, top 10% national income shares across the world. in the early 1980s, there were no country or regions in the world with a top 10% income share over 35% of the total. And we see this general rise in inequality, in income inequality, but that happened at very different speeds. And the underlying drivers of these differences, again, this is a matter of policy design. So it's very hard to just stay on basic explanations of the rise of inequality with explanations like technology or trade when you see these differences across countries which went through, at least for some of them, similar development, technological development, or globalization transformations across the past decade. So this is just this basic reminder that policy matters tremendously in explaining these trends. Now let me focus a little on the evolution of wealth inequality over the past decades. And what this graph shows you is, so we're ranking the global population from the poorest individuals on the left to the richest individuals on the right, according to the level of wealth they have. And on the vertical axis, what we have here is the growth rate in wealth, net of inflation. What the graph shows us is what has been termed as an elephant curve, in the sense that you have the silhouette of an elephant with a very rising trunk. So this kind of representation, we've been doing quite a bit of them in the previous edition of this report, and colleagues such as Branko Milanovic have developed that kind of representation of global inequality. Now we're doing this for wealth and not for income. And what we observe is, this also very striking representation of globalization, where, a part of the world, the bottom 50%, perhaps the bottom 75% of the world population has, enjoyed relatively good wealth growth levels, above 3%, above 4% annual wealth growth. Now, if we look at the segment of the world population between the percentile 80 and the percentile 99, or a little higher, these rates of wealth growth has been lower than that. And in some countries, if we were looking more into the detail, it's even much lower. And then at the very top of the global wealth distribution, very huge rates of wealth growth, which correspond to what you observe when you look at your rich lists and the rankings from the magazine. That's wealth growth rate over 8%, 9% on average per year, which is absolutely huge. So the snowballing effect of wealth accumulation is really playing out here. Now, what this graph also tells us is that not only wealth growth rate were huge at the very top, but the graph also tells us that from a macroeconomic perspective, they were enormous in the share of total wealth growth captured that these represent. The top 1% itself captured close to 40% of all total wealth creation since the mid-1990s. Whereas the bottom 50% of the world population captured just 2% of total new wealth creation over the period. So very unequal wealth creation over the past few decades. And it's very...
Luca, yes? Just sorry, we would need to maybe wrap up with your final thoughts, as we're really running out of time. Thanks again.
Sure. So let me skip the billionaire wealth issue and just give two little insights into the new dimensions of this report and how this can be relevant for social protection discussions. In this report, we present new results on global gender inequality, and this is what you observe here. We show that women earn just a third of all incomes worldwide, and that if we continue current trends, it will take over 100 years to reach global parity So this really raises questions into how are our social security protection systems fit for this challenge. First point, and the second, I'm skipping these graphs, and the second point is really about the inequality of carbon emissions. This is also a novelty from this report, where what you see on this graph is not, shares of income anymore. It's really tons of carbon emitted by different groups of the population. And what we show here really is that carbon inequality in pollution is not just a rich versus poor country issue, but really there are high emitters in low-income countries, and there are low emitters or relatively low emitters in rich countries. And the key message from this work here is that our economic policies, our social policies, our climate policies are not very well fit for addressing this challenge. And a lot of the climate policies that have been discussed and designed over the past few years do not really see this vast inequality in polluters within nations. And I think this is also a new key challenge for social protection, to be able to factor in this great inequality in polluters at the level of countries, within countries. So let me, I can come back on these slides maybe in the discussion if we have time, but to conclude, the key point here of this report, of this body of work, is that inequality is a political choice, that low inequality is possible with high economic prosperity, but more and more we need to look beyond, the standard dimensions of inequality, income and wealth, towards, these other dimensions, including gender and carbon. And when it comes to carbon inequality, a key message that we're putting forward in this report is that it will be very hard to have decarbonization without a lot of redistribution, without transfers from high emitters, high wealth and high income individuals, transfers from them to finance the development of low carbon alternatives for low income and middle groups, whether in rich or low income countries. There's indeed much more in the report, and I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Luca. I think we need probably much more time to go deep into the report, which is so rich and so many insights. Thanks again. But I think we really gathered kind of the gist of the key messages, and definitely I think here one key message that kind of came out is first that the poorest are really lagging behind. And that's something we need to factor in. As you know, UNDP is really trying to advance on this agenda by having this moonshot of lifting 100 million people out of poverty. And that speaks a lot to how we actually get the right data sets, the right metrics and analytics to make sure that we have the evidence-based policies. And I think that's really what we're trying to do here, to have the body of evidence that can really help us tailor our policy responses to address these structural issues. And one key example that you showed was, the issue of, the criticality of progressive taxation, which plays a key role both in pre and post distribution and redistribution. I think that's something that's really important to factor in. And lastly, you also discuss the gender inequality. That's really so glaring that needs to be addressed, but also the current dimension of it. Thanks again so much, Luca. This is very much appreciated. Let me now turn to our next speaker. That will be Heriberto. And what we want to do here is really also to look at inequality beyond income. And so, Heriberto, my question to you is, how does the Human Development Report Office expand the frontier on inequality from a human development perspective? Over to you for 6 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Mansour. My pleasure to be here. First, I want to congratulate Lucas and the colleagues in the World Inequality Lab for this effort, this excellent report. We are very proud partners. And coming to your question, what we are doing is quite complementary to what Lucas is doing, but trying to highlight the nature of human development that goes beyond income. And as we said in our 2019 Human Development Report also, beyond averages and beyond today. We need to be able to look toward the future. So I have a few slides just to guide the conversation, just a couple of messages. So first, for us, inequality is not just an indicator, it's an essential element in the consideration of human development. So we have an index of inequality adjusted human development that says that humanity, the loss because of inequality is around 20% of the equivalent in human development, so it's big. However, we also been developing new metrics in order to assess the evolution of this inequality. And one of the key insights is that in the last few decades, even though there has been a reduction in some inequalities, the ones that represent the more basic elements in development, you know, the inequalities in access to basic education, basic health services, etc., that inequality has been going down. Inequality is growing in other elements that become increasingly important for people that reflect high quality education, access to high quality health services, access to new technologies. And for us, this is a very worrisome trend that we keep studying. And the key element here for us is that is agency. So to what extent we are being able to capture the agency of people and how, even though eventually some access to resources might be getting more equal in terms of the access to power, access to the ability to do more things, agency is getting more unequally distributed. One example is what is happening with gender inequality, and actually is a stat that is shared in the World Inequality Report, that we see that gender inequality is slowing down. And in part it's because the space for the gains in the basic elements of power is depleting, and the gains in the spaces that bring more power are getting slower. Just two additional points. One is that for us, inequality is also key to understand the process of development in the context of the Anthropocene. So the planetary imbalances are very linked to the social imbalances. And so what Lucas mentioned about the carbon emissions is critical to understand these dynamics. But something that we have been exploring is that we are really in trouble because the dynamic is very destabilizing. So on the one hand, we have some of the results presented by Lucas and others that are telling us that in general, the carbon inequalities are very high. Here to the left, we have inequalities per country groups. So the more developed countries emit more carbon. But also we are exploring the other side. So what is happening with the distribution of the cost of these planetary imbalances? And we see how the countries that are poorer will tend to face most of the cost, in this case, in the numbers of days with extreme temperatures. So from the point of view of the incentive, this is a big problem for the world because the countries that are more benefiting from climate change are also the ones that will face least of the cost. Just to close, because I think this is just to open the conversation. So we are going to be in the next few months exploring more this connection and trying to see the side of the distribution of the cost of climate change with more and more granularity. So this is the big challenge for the future. Again, the Beyond Today part of our agenda, to try to understand with granularity what is going to happen in different, it's likely to happen depending on our choices, a big important point by Lucas, in different parts of the world. So this is just a picture of a platform that we will be making available, because in this way we will understand how different areas with a lot of granularity will be affected through different dimensions of human development. In this case, it's about the labor demand. So we have very few, I have very few minutes, so this is just to trigger the discussion. All of this has effect for social protection, because these are effects that we have to deal with. But again, I would like to congratulate Lucas, and we look forward to continue this partnership. Over.
Thanks so much, Harry, and thanks for sharing your perspectives on how to look at inequality from a broader perspective, which is exactly what we're trying to nail down with this question. I think it's important that you mentioned that what we're saying is growing inequalities in areas that matter and will matter for the future of our children, and those are areas that we really need to look at, kind of a future-proof approach to inequalities and how we address that, moving forward. But also one key question is, look at the distribution of these impacts. Who benefits? Who loses? And I think that's really important question to really kind of come up with very tailored responses to those kind of questions. Thanks again. Let me now turn to Shivani, and just building on what was said earlier by Luca on the World Inequality Report. What we did internally was to rework the data and to look also at the bottom 30%. So, and there, the insights are striking. Really, the poorest are being left behind, and even worse than what we initially anticipated. So my question to you, Shivani, is really in response to the COVID-19 crisis, countries across the board have stepped up their social protection responses, definitely. Now, the question is, to what extent can these or has been these channels towards addressing persistent inequalities towards transformational change? Over to you for 5-6 minutes.
Thank you, Mansoor. As you summarized the paper really well, basically, we have shown that the bottom 40 are even further behind than was thought. And we compare it with more traditional data, the POC-CalNet data, and clearly the world is not on the path to achieving SDGs on inequality. This was the case before COVID-19, and COVID-19 has exacerbated existing inequalities, and the world faces a multitude of such challenges. Now, social protection policy can play an important role in addressing inequalities, including underlying systemic inequalities. Of course, tax policies, including progressive taxation and income and wealth taxation, are key, not least to finance social policies. However, in a world of rising uncertainty, social protection policies can be a valuable tool in addressing inequality. First, we have to see to what extent countries have a shock responsive social protection system in place, so we can protect people and forestall reversal in SDGs and long-term losses in human development. This involves identification and protection of those whose lives, jobs, or livelihoods are impacted by a shock or crisis. During COVID-19, we saw that countries that already had systems in place were able to provide cash and in-kind transfers to those who needed them, while other countries need to have these systems in place. This is also shown in the policy brief by Santiago and Maria. Second, we need to go beyond cash and in-kind transfers. Social protection, including health and unemployment insurance, disability insurance, and life cycle-based transfers, such as pensions and child benefits, are key in addressing underlying inequalities, removing the structural barriers that people face. And here I will also refer to the free distribution that was mentioned by Lucas, because all of these policies are going towards improving that. This is especially given that we live in a world where high insecurity and inequality are reinforcing each other every day. We are looking at more frequent and severe shocks from the Anthropocene, from conflicts, and from the economic fallout of these. Given that girls and women face some of the starkest underlying inequalities that also make them the most vulnerable in times of crisis, social protection has to be gender sensitive. To what extent has social protection actually addressed underlying inequalities? The evidence is coming in. Again, Santiago and Maria's paper is a good example where they have shown that not a lot of countries were able to measure up. At UNDP, through its network of regional and country offices, we are supporting countries to improve inequality metrics in the first place, and then to strengthen their social protection systems, including through strong partnerships with ILO and others. And the overarching framework that we are using is addressing persistent inequality and poverty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shivani, and great that you stick with your time allocated. That's great as we're running out of time. And I think those are very good points and very good learnings in terms of ensuring that we strengthen actually social protection systems to be able to cope with shocks, to be able to be resilient to and responsive to gender dimension of others. So very good points. Thanks again. Now let me turn to Santiago, because of course, putting in place social protection responses has a strong linkages with the fiscal space that we have to be able to do that. So Santiago, the question is, we all agree that there is a strong correlation between the level of social policy responses and the fiscal space of countries. Now, how linked is the social protection agenda globally with tax policies, such as those proposed by Shivani, like those progressive taxation and so on and so forth? Over to you, Santiago.
Okay, yeah, of course. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Of course, I think the upfront and it's somehow obvious answer is that both agendas should be intertwined, and there's no way of having broad and effective social protection system without proper financing of such systems. Lucas made that point also very, very clear. And I think the taxing agenda proposed by Christian and Giovanni in their policy brief is comprehensive enough. It includes some suggestion of progressive taxation, incidence of taxation, wealth taxation, the digital economy, global taxes. So I think that agenda intertwines perfectly with the social protection agenda that we need. And basically, I think the connection between these two agendas is threefold in a way. The first one, as you stated in the question, in our brief with Maria, we document remarkable and worrisome association between the amplitude of the social policy responses and also the fiscal capacity of countries, what we call, in a way, the depth in terms of GDP spending efforts of countries, and the breadth in terms of the amplitude of the instruments of social assistance, insurance, social insurance, and labor market policies. And to quote an example of this, only developed countries could resort to a broad set of instruments of social protection. If we think of the response, lower income countries and lower middle income countries use on average less than 10% of the available tools in terms of social protection. And none of these countries could resort to a response as ample as the average breadth response of upper middle income and higher income countries. So you can split the social protection response of the world into two halves in terms of its breadth. That comes on top of the difference that we are seeing in the depth of the response in terms of resources allocated to social protection. The second element is that even when social protection systems were highly conditioned by income level of each country, I think all countries resorted to the assistance dimension of social protection. And in a way, we find out that this breaks a bit of previous trends that place social assistance, especially CCTs, and some discussions that it was an emerging instrument fundamentally aimed at developing countries in the past. And I believe this can also be connected to the need of a strong taxing policies to fund such social policies for the long term, even in developing countries. And I think this connects to UBI discussions and such. And third and finally, this is something we discuss a lot with Maria, with Eduardo, and also with Jorge Molina. There are very distinctive political economy challenges to establishing and sustaining labor market policy, social insurance, social assistance, the components of social protection. Labor market, such as furloughs, have specific challenges. To quote some, business can only get furloughs if they are compensated for loss in business, labor, and business activities. Social insurance policies, we know, are very complex policies to implement in the long term. It involves state, business, and workers. But connecting to the taxing agenda and to the second element I've already mentioned, the political economy challenges of social assistance tend to be mostly fiscal and consolidating support from taxpaying to recipients. So I think this can be directly linked to some of the taxing policies and problems that have been pointed out by Christian and Shivani, but of course also by Lucas in his presentation. To wrap up, none of this is easy. With Maria, we'll ask an open question at the end of the brief on the roads to building social protection systems, and we say why not start from gradually additions of those citizens excluded. We are seeing in the data that some countries quickly responded to the crisis with a broad social protection system, and having that broad social protection system was a prerequisite for innovation. And the key question is still how feasible it is to make these emergency changes permanent, and how to transform social protection to tackle multiple challenges. Now we are adding on top things related to the war and food insecurity in many countries. We are seeing that, of course, this happened after we finish our brief. So finally, the future of social protection will be shaped by the efficacy, delivery of social protection. It will be delimited by the depth in terms of fiscal restrictions, but at the very end, and this is something that we've seen in the data, but something that we already know beforehand, it's that basically when it comes to the capacity to implement social policy, we have to build viable political coalition to shape and sustain broad-based social protection system. And of course, these coalition building efforts are very much related to the coalition building efforts that we need to fund through taxation, progressive taxation, and the challenges we have to sustain this social policy intervention. So basically, that would be my answer.
Thank you so much, and Santiago. And you're very right in saying that this is not only a technical issue. We can go through the technicalities, but after all, it's also a political economy issue, and this points to the fact that this is also very much linked to this need of a renewed social contract. Building coalitions to be to have the support of a large part of the population to really be able to implement such a difficult and challenging ambition, which is about to basically to reinvent social protection, to make it fit for the needs of today and the future. Thanks so much. Let me now, last but not the least, turn to Maria, and I think we discussed the issue of fiscal space. Now, our question, of course, is what were the other determinants of this emergency response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and what do they imply for the use of social protection to address poverty and inequality? Over to you, Maria. Would appreciate 5 minutes if that's feasible. Thanks.
Thanks, Mansour, and thanks for inviting me. Well, first of all, as Santiago said, it's true there was a significant difference in the magnitude and amplitude of the social protection response during COVID across income groups. But this was not only determined by the fiscal space, but also by other factors that also vary across income groups. And there was also important variation within groups. Some countries that did very well, even among lower middle income countries, even among upper middle income countries. So I'm going to try and develop some ideas about that. One important thing was that the level of informality was important for the timeliness of the response. In some countries, especially in high-income countries where social protection systems are universal and there are certain instruments already in place, such as unemployment insurance, the response kicked in immediately. People may have lost their jobs and immediately they have the support they needed. But in most countries in the developing world, existing social protection instruments that could work quickly were mostly only social assistance, safety nets that rely on cash transfers or in-kind transfers. And while those were leveraged in most of the cases by expanding them vertically, this means giving another higher benefit or for a longer time, they had to change to cover more population that were at risk given the shock. And this is what some have been called the missing middle, individuals that have whose level of income and income generating assets make them be above the poverty line, but they're particularly vulnerable to shocks and can be easily pushed to poverty. And they are not covered by social insurance because most of them are in informal employment. So these people were not covered by the social protection system, and they have to be quickly included. So this was a challenge that countries faced, to expand horizontally, to reach more individuals, to create new programs for specific groups. And their success was largely dependent on factors like the availability of data to identify new beneficiaries, the infrastructure they had for delivery, institutional rigidity, level of financial inclusion, things like that. And I think this lesson of scaling up social protection and respond to shocks is crucial for the future of social protection. As Shivani said, this is something that we will be facing continuously, mainly because of shocks related to climate-related disasters, for example. And we know we already have important challenges for addressing poverty and inequality in the part of the redistribution of the after taxes part. And there's a lot to do there in terms of strengthening existing social protection instruments, the social assistance nets. But we also need to adapt the systems to work, to be flexible, to work for shocks. And this can be done by updating social registries, delivery capacities, to focus on mobile money, so that programs can be suited for expansion. And the second thing is what I was saying about the mixed middle, to include non-poor but vulnerable people, to include people in informal employment. There have been discussions about voluntary mechanisms for informal workers to have voluntary savings in flexible contributions. And the third part, I think, is that countries need to develop a risk financing strategy, and not only countries by themselves, but the international community. As we've seen, shocks, for instance, the COVID pandemic was not independent shocks. We were all countries were related to one another, and a shift needs to occur from considering these shocks as unpredictable crises to predictable events that can be planned. And this can be done with risk layering, mixing budgetary instruments with market instruments. But the big issue here is that financing will still be out of reach for many low-income countries. And I think this is particularly related to the last issue that Lucas showed in his presentation about carbon injustice and how there's a shared responsibility in the climate change effects and how we are going to address it and incorporate between countries, so that this is not another source of between country inequality and within country inequality. And the final issue, I just want to make a comment on the gender issue that was largely missing from the response. UNDP and UN Women developed a global gender response, and they found that only a third of the policy responses were gender sensitive, that they address unpaid care, violence against women, or women's economic security. And the issue of unpaid care needs to be an issue in the future of social protection. It would have been interesting to look at a graph showing the inequalities in women's income side by side with the distribution of unpaid care and care work in general in the economy. So just food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. Very, very good points. And I think we agree that a number of those challenges need to address, especially how to keep that momentum. Building on the political will of countries to really scale up and extend. How to address the missing middles, like the informal economic workers and so on and so forth, that have not many options to benefit from social protection. And of course, this risk, financing strategy, I think is critical. And I think with that, the integrated national finance framework can also provide some kind of start of a response to that, to really kind of address those. But what comes clearly is that, broadening the fiscal space cannot be left only to countries that are, really struggling to address those. There needs support from the international community. Thanks again, Maria. Very good points. Now, colleagues, I would like to open up an opportunity for a Q&A sessions. We have 10 minutes for that. We already have a number of questions in the Q&A box. Maybe let me start with Loka. I picked up 2 questions here that were shared initially. I think the aspect of the gender, has been addressed both from that angle, but also from the gender tracker, UNDP and UN Women. But here, one question is, based on your presentation, would you suggest governments to focus more on redistributive policies than else? That's the first question. And the second question, which is a bit linked to that, is how to reverse these large wealth inequalities. Lucas, over to you, maybe for your perspectives on that.
Thank you very much, Mansour. I've already answered partly some of the questions, so those who might be interested, please also have a look at the chat. Redistribution or pre-distribution, one point I'd like to make is a historical observation. In the 20th century, when you observe this moment of a good economic growth in the West, high social protection, growing social protection, reduced inequalities, this is really the moment where you have in line the growth of progressive taxation on the one side and of social protection on the other. So it's really this political economy situation where you have the acceptation of higher progressive taxes because they are financing important investments for all, and even more for the less well-off. So you basically have this three pillars system whereby you have progressive taxes, you have investment in education and health, universal for everybody. So this broadens the scope of people who will basically accept to contribute to paying taxes. That's because of universal benefits from what these taxes can finance, and also the acceptance of giving even more to the worse off. So really it's this kind of integrated package of social policy and progressive taxes which made this particular moment of history between, say, the 1970s and the 1980s in some countries of this in this planet. Now, the challenges ahead, I think, is really how do we design, so how we rethink social protection in rich countries to factor in what had not been factored in before, i.e. environment, rights of minorities, gender inequality. So how we factor this in the current design of social protection, and a lot needs to be done. And I think this is also what is interesting here. All countries need to improve. All countries need to learn from each other. It's not just low-income emerging countries that need to learn from what happened in the West. That's one point. The second is in emerging countries, low-income countries, basically how can we also leapfrog from current system where social protection is lacking in many contexts, where tax capacity is also lacking in many contexts, to not just copy what is there, what is present in developed countries, but to invent new systems that are more integrated. And here I think that what happens in some countries, for instance in Ethiopia, where you have these systems of rapid cash transfers for zones, for households that might be impacted by coming periods of heat stress, for instance, or climate stress, through systems, sensor systems, where you're going to try to anticipate, identify which areas might be affected by some environmental periods of stress. I think this is very interesting, and that this can be developed also in rich countries, because rich countries also need to, update their climate, social security protection systems. I think another interesting insight or lesson we can learn, or which countries can learn from emerging countries, is what happened in Indonesia in the context of their large overhaul of their fossil fuel subsidy system, which led to an increase in energy prices. And this increase in energy prices, because it was associated to a reduction in fossil fuel subsidies by the government, more resources for the governments, more cash in the hands of the government, which was used to basically do new social security protection investments, to expand the scope of the health, universal health security system that was financed through this change in the tax regime of energy. And this is something that all countries can learn from. So again, here, social security protection investments or spending and taxes are really hard to dissociate. So really it's pre-distribution and redistribution that go hand in hand. That's how I would answer this important question.
Thanks so much, Luca. Thanks for your insightful perspectives. Let me turn to Eri. There is a question for you here in the chat box, and it's from Bishwa. It says, apart from market policies such as wage policy, fiscal policy, what's the role of pre-market and post-market policies in developing countries in addressing inequalities? Do you have any perspective to offer on that?
Thank you, Mansour. Actually, I would like to iterate around what Lucas was saying. So from the point of view of human development, certainly we think it's crucial to create new capabilities. So, and this is what goes within what we call these pre-market policies. So to endow people with capabilities to operate with a higher education, good levels of health, etc. That will increase their productivity. They will allow them to make good choices for their lives. But in order to do that, it's essential to also match this effort with redistributive policies, because this is expensive to have an educational system. And but Lucas, I think, explained it very well. In the cases where this work is because the countries were able to link both of them in creating a virtuous cycle.
Absolutely, Eri. Thanks so much. We only have 3 minutes left, but I have one question that was initially for Luca, but I would like to maybe offer both to Maria, Santiago, and Shivani also the chance if they wish to share some perspective. And the question is from Danielle, and it goes like this: if we think about reducing inequalities, what's the more relevant, social protection policies or the construction of the welfare state? So his take is, is it correct to think social protection is focused on the most vulnerable, while welfare state has a broader coverage? So colleagues, Maria, Santiago, Shivani, feel free to come in. Yeah, just last chance to share views on this. Shivani, please.
Sure, I can come in. Thank you. Yes, it's common to see that social protection usually focuses on the most poor in society, but one of the things that recent crises have shown us, right from the global economic crisis about a decade ago, and then the COVID economic fallout, is that exactly the point that Maria was making about the missing middle and what Vishwa raised in the chat, that there are so many people who are in the informal economy who are not covered by social insurance, not covered by social security measures. And a lot of the work that we are doing at UNDP now and other agencies are doing is focusing on that segment of the population. And the idea is exactly to go beyond just social assistance and cash and in-kind transfers, but to build programs which are maybe a little bit contributory, but also they have non-contributory elements, they have some subsidy elements for health insurance, for unemployment insurance, for other tools like that. And this is all part of the welfare system. This is not something separate. So that's how I see it. Thank you.
Thanks, Shivani. Santiago, would you like to come in?
Yeah, just to jump in to add to what Shivani said, I completely agree with what she said. I think we might have this small window of opportunity right now. I think after COVID crisis, what we've seen is that the use of social protection tools across the board in all countries has been unprecedented. And also the perception, and if you complement that with another surveys that have been carried out, like the perception of the risks that most of the population have in terms of social protection has increased the awareness of the necessity of these tools. So an optimistic approach would be that we might have this window of opportunity to establish social protection that contribute to a broader view of welfare system in many developed, at least in many developing countries, and we've seen that in some specific countries too.
Great, thanks so much, Santiago. Let me now just give a final opportunity to Luca or Maria or Carolina for any final thoughts before we actually wrap up. We only have 5 minutes left, so the floor is yours if you want to share any final thoughts or remark. If not, we'll move to the wrap-up session. Luca, any final thoughts? Maria, Carolina?
Just picking up of what Santiago was mentioning here about the particular time we live in after almost 2 years of COVID, after we're in the midst of this war in Ukraine, and with a series of economic sanctions against Russia, which basically tell us two things these past 2 years, is that the economic policy toolkit is much broader than we typically think it is. And we've seen this very clearly in the context of the COVID crisis, with the strong rise of social transfers, protection of millions and millions of workers in certain key sectors of the economy. What we also see in the current set of sanctions of so many countries in the world is that when you really want to take on actors that have been benefiting from tax evasion over the world, and that are investing their money in offshore centers, well, it's possible to do much more than we typically tend to do, and we see this with the freezing of certain assets of certain individuals. And this can also teach us lessons for the future if we really want to tackle tax evasion, which undermines the social contract in so many countries, and which undermines the very possibilities to do social protection. Then we can learn from what we're currently doing. So, what's going to happen next is uncertain. It will depend a lot on, as we've been discussing, the ability of people building up coalitions for creating social protection, for designing progressive taxation. But we can learn from what is being done, and I tend to agree with this idea of window of opportunity, or at least in another way, perhaps expansion of the policy toolkit for government.
Thanks so much, Luca, and fully agree with that. Before maybe I share my final remarks, I'd like to invite Eri to share, few thoughts before we actually wrap up. Eri, over to you.
Thank you, Mansour. I simply wanted to thank you for the opportunity of bringing us together. I think this is a great opportunity to keep the momentum and working together. The work of the World Inequality Lab is excellent, and is pushing the frontier in many directions. And this can be very important to support agendas that we are having in different countries. So in terms of new information, how to compute income inequality, how to compute the distributive effect of different policies, how to use new technologies in order to understand more and reduce the opacity of our accounts. This also is happening in a moment when the Secretary General is pushing the Beyond GDP agenda that includes improving the current computation of GDP, so the distribution of national accounts come right on time. So, and I think this is something that we can do also from UNDP. So from my side, just to invite colleagues to keep engaged with us, with you, Mansour, with Lucas, and all colleagues, because I think that there is a lot to do at different levels, and we can support each other. Over.
Thanks so much, Eri, and really let me second your opinions there, because I think for me the key word is we have a unique window of opportunity to connect the dots, to learn, to share, and to push the envelope. this will not happen again, anytime in the near future. And what is important here, I think, is that we're looking at a global issue that doesn't speak to any specific region. It's a global challenge, in terms of inequality, social protection. And this is why we also have this opportunity to build on this ambitious initiative that was announced by Secretary General, which is what they call the Global Social Protection and Jobs Accelerator, which actually tries to address this challenge globally, building coalitions to really, address those challenges, including the financing aspect. And just for the record, we are leading in some of those discussions with the ILO. So we'll be really happy to build all this, wealth of insights and learnings, and to bring that into that conversation. And really would like to have everyone on board to make sure that we, they push the agenda. The second bit is, I think, something that was also mentioned, which is that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We actually navigating in a very different landscape. So there are learning opportunities, north-south, south-south, triangular, where we can really learn on what works, the best practices, the next practices. That's what we call the next practices in the report that we developed last year with the International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth, looking at what social protection policies actually are having transformational change and impact. So that's definitely an angle to look at. And the final thought that I would like to share here is this need to rethink social protection, definitely. This cannot be just like the single entry point solution that we used to have. This is really looking at it from an integrated perspective, from a broader perspective, where we bring in the equations, issues like gender responsiveness, carbon, and so on and so forth. So I think this is, really an opportune time for us to connect the dots. So I'll be looking forward to, really working with you, with Ari, with Luca and colleagues to really drive this agenda forward. So final thought will be more to come. And let us try to, take it further. Thanks again. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Luca. Really appreciate your contribution.
Thank you so much.
Colleagues, really look forward to, further taking this agenda forward. Thanks again. And over. Have a great day ahead.